Hi, and welcome to this video series on community input for the 2023 budget. In this series, we will break down the information we heard from the public about what they want to see in next year's budget. There were 4 themes that arose from all the community input we received, which were community services, public safety, revenue and growth, and public works and infrastructure. This video will focus on the input we received about community services. Community services represent the functional area of the budget that covers departments such as parks and recreation, transit, planning and urban design, aging, economic development, elections, the health department, historical museum, human services, and the neighborhood resource center. Stay tuned for more videos on other themes. Let's start by discussing the channels of community outreach that we use to get community feedback. This graphic shows all the ways that we collected community input for this budget cycle. As you can see, we analyzed community comparisons, held budget hearings, distributed a community survey, and then new to this year, we held Dotte talks, increased our social media engagement, and released a budget simulator. As we can see here, these are the number of participants and respondents we got from each channel of input. Notably, the community survey has far and above the most participation out of any channel, and participants in this survey make up the only representative sample out of any of the channels. Representative means that the sample is comparable to our community as a whole on major demographic areas such as age, sex, race, education, and income. Now that we've discussed how community input was collected, let's dive into what we heard about community services. We will first discuss the main themes, and then we will dive into more detail about the issues of code enforcement and parks and recreation. This slide highlights the main themes that arose about community services from each channel of input. From our data and comparisons research, we saw that a decrease in overall community satisfaction was comparable to other communities, probably due to COVID. We also found that the UG falls in the mid-range when compared to resources allocated to code enforcement and street sweeping in other regional areas. We also found that of a group of 16 similar communities, the UG spends second to lowest on parks and recreation. From the budget hearings, we heard that community centers should have their own operating funds so they can make the types of changes needed. From the 2022 community survey, we saw that 76% of respondents gave positive feedback on the public health response to COVID. We also saw a desire to focus on motor vehicles, senior services, and programs for people with developmental disabilities. Finally, some of the top priorities that emerged from the community survey were the maintenance of city streets, police services, code enforcement, and parks and recreation facilities. From the Dotte talks, we heard a need for more community services, including from the transit, health, aging, parks, and NRC departments. We also heard the desire for services to be more accessible. People also shared that they would like to see more volunteer opportunities. We must address inequity and enforce the rules. And finally, a popular request was made for affordable housing as we recover from COVID-19. Moving to the budget simulator, we saw comments pushing the UG to invest in better, more equitable code enforcement. We also heard the need to improve parks by better maintaining what we have or adding new programming and/or amenities. Finally, it was notable that the average funding level change was in line with revenue adjustments for community service departments. Now that we've overviewed the main themes, let's dive further into the data. This table comes from the community survey, and community services are circled in yellow. The table compares the importance of services to the satisfaction with the service. The services closest to the top of the table represent areas that are lower in satisfaction and higher in importance, or in other words, areas we need to focus on improving. So in terms of the community services circled here, we see that code enforcement represents the service with the most room for improvement when it comes to importance and satisfaction. 35% of respondents ranked code enforcement as the most important service area, and only 28% of respondents were satisfied with this service. Code enforcement is the community service here with the most potential to improve satisfaction, as the percent satisfied is lower than the percent who ranked it most important. Now let's move to more qualitative data we heard from the public at the Dotte talks and through the budget simulator. These quotes come directly from what we heard at the Dotte talks and from the budget simulator about community services. I will now go through and read the quotes. First, someone shared, We have one of the lowest levels of funding for parks and recreation across similar communities in the region. They said, we spend a small portion of our budget on community services. Someone recommended that the UG map community resources across the county to identify gaps and needs. Someone shared, and I quote, I would like to see aging services expanded, especially after COVID hit Wyandotte County so hard. We heard the need for more funding for social services, including parks and rec programming, more public transit, and more mental health and treatment and services. One person shared that they have to leave the county to get the things they need and want. We also heard someone say that they'd like to get more involved, but volunteering for the UG isn't easy. Now that we've heard some of the public's direct quotes, let's analyze the budget simulator results for community services. This information breaks down budget simulator results for community service departments. The graph on the top right shows the average percent change that respondents applied to each community service department's budget. We have highlighted the average percent change in revenue streams for comparison. Notice that the average decrease in revenues was lower than the average decrease in spending for 5 community service departments. The bottom graph shows the average percent change to community services as compared to other functional areas of the budget. Proposed changes to community services funding were roughly equal to the average revenue reduction seen across the simulator. In fact, people reduced revenues by slightly more than they decreased community services funding. Now let's move to what we heard about community services at the ARPA workshop. Another area we heard public input on community services was at the ARPA workshop, where residents emphasized affordable housing as a top priority for recovering from COVID-19. The chart on the right shows the results of 4 polls asking participants in the ARPA workshop to rate the most important way to invest ARPA funds. The results show that most participants rated affordable housing as the most important, then investment to promote economic opportunity, childcare and early childhood education, and finally, behavioral health and mental health. Now we'll move to discussing parks and recreation, another important topic for our community. We heard through multiple channels that the community would like to see increased funding for parks and recreation, and so we compared our per capita park spending to other similar communities. This graph shows our per capita parks and recreation spending compared to communities that were chosen based on similar demographic areas such as median household income, population, and geographic proximity. The graph shows that of the communities analyzed, the UG spends second to lowest on parks and recreation per capita. One way to look at the graph is to consider what it would cost to raise our funding to the level of other communities. For example, if we chose the community of Columbia and Boone County, Missouri, which falls about in the middle of the graph, we could calculate how much we would need to increase our parks budget by to arrive at the same per capita level of funding. We can do so by subtracting our per capita spending from theirs and multiplying that by our population. Doing so, we see that to spend $131 per capita on parks and recreation, we would need to increase the parks and recreation budget by $11,745,000. Try doing this calculation on your own for other communities you are interested in. Now we will discuss codes and ordinances. Another community service that stuck out in our outreach was the enforcement of codes and ordinances. This graph compares responses on the community survey from 2016 and 2022, and we see that the biggest decrease in resident satisfaction across that time period was for code and ordinance issues such as the mowing and trimming of weeds on private or vacant property and the cleanup of junk, trash, and debris. Also on the issue of code enforcement, we see that when we compare our code enforcement and street cleanings to other communities, we land in the middle of the pack. This information comes from the Mid-America Regional Council's Regional Benchmarking Initiative from 2021, so the communities included here are different from before. In the top graph, we see that of the communities included, KCK has the third to highest number of full-time code enforcement inspectors per square mile. In the bottom graph, we see that we fall in the middle of the number of street sweepings per year. Finally, we conclude this video with the top insight we heard from the community about community services, which was to focus on reducing blight and improving access to public amenities, whether through type, cost, location, hours, volunteering, or other avenues. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for videos summarizing the other major themes we heard from community input budget process this year.